Hello and thanks for joining me. Let's chat for a bit about For 2000 Years by Mihail Sebastian. This is the most recent book that I finished, and following this chat I'll also touch base briefly on what I'm currently reading, as well as chat a bit about my planned interruption reads that I have coming up for the month of April, so more on that following the chat. But back to For 2000 Years by Mihail Sebastian. This was originally published in 1934 in Romania, and it did not appear in English until 2016. This particular edition that I read was published by Other Press and has a foreword by Mark Mazur and was published in 2017. I read this book electronically. This book got onto my reading radar at the beginning of last year. We went to visit some friends in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minnesota, and my friend there has a subscription to the New York Review of Books. So all my spare time, I found a comfy chair. She had all the back issues there in a basket, and I just sat there and read through the New York Reviews of Books in my spare time. And this is how I originally learned about this book. I put it on my want to read list, and then this year, the end of last year, whenever I was curating my 2018 priority reading list, I had a theme. I was choosing books around certain themes, and one of them was identity. And around identity, I wanted to make sure and get a couple of works in that were pertaining to people who have identities that run counter to the society at large or the culture at large around them. And so I decided to choose this one because our narrator here is a young Jewish student in 1920s Romania. So at odds and experiencing the anti-Semitism of that time and place. So yeah, I wanted to get it read for that reason. What this is about, it's in a diary format. Like I said, it is a work of fiction, but our narrator is a young student, and this book starts out in the it's like 1923, and there's a lot of social unrest going on at this point in Romania. I wasn't real familiar with the history. I actually looked it up to try to get a little background because I didn't really understand what the political situation was. I figured that a reader in 1934 would be aware of it, but I wasn't. So I did look it up, and there was some social unrest going on there. I think from what I could understand, actually Jewish people got legal equality at that point with the new constitution in Romania. But nevertheless, there was this outbreak of very relatively violent anti-Semitism and among the students, especially at this university where our narrator is attending. So he experiences this, just random beatings. His friends, other Jewish students, some are expelled. They have a hard time attending class. Sometimes they're just forced out of class. If they try to attend a class, then the other students will beat them up or whatever, or threaten them until they leave. So he's trying to attend university in this atmosphere, believe it or not. He does eventually move into a sort of a dorm for Jewish students. There was always this threat that the university was going to completely close. So he's sort of in this social milieu. He's also a young man at the university who's trying to figure out what he wants to do with his life. So there's a lot going on with him that's really left him, really, I think, with a feeling of alienation. He doesn't really feel, connected. Obviously, he's being outcast and othered by the greater society around him. But he also has a hard time really identifying with the other Jewish students. And he just feels really alone. There's a quote that I thought I would read that really sort of illustrates this very nicely. This is from early in the book and during this period around 1923 when he's at the university. He says, "Jewish fellow feeling, I hate it. I'm always on the brink of shouting out a coarse word just to show that even though I'm in the midst of 10 people who believe me their brother in suffering, I am in fact absolutely, definitively alone." So yeah, I thought that quote was, really illustrates just how alienated really he felt. He does meet a mentor kind of professor, I guess, who he really admires, but other than that, he just sort of drifts. This mentor of his sort of suggests that he study architecture, which he winds up doing. And then, as the diary, the fictional diary progresses, he does eventually make it through school. He's a young man then working, I guess it's an apprentice architect, and is working on an economic project in another part of Romania. But the diary entries are really just sort of like, it actually reads sort of really like a diary. And so we get glimpses of his social, he does have a girlfriend that's sort of indifferent to. It doesn't last particularly long, but then, his other friends that he has this married couple that are friends. And then the wife eventually starts having an affair with his friend. So it's just sort of these kind of ups and downs of life. I think that young people, well, not just necessarily young people, but all people go through. During this period of time following his university years, things sort of stabled out in Romania, and the anti-Semitism sort of calms down for a while. But it's always a presence with him, and he sees it still, all around him. But the violent part of it has sort of lessened at this point. But then by the time the book progresses on to we're in the early 30s now. Remember, it was published in 1934, so. I remember it being at one point like 1931. There's social unrest again, and the Jewish people continually get blamed for this in a sort of a never-ending, it seems like, cycle. And he talks about this, how it seems to be the fate of Jewish people to be always in this cycle of violence and anti-Semitism, and then periods of relative stability, and then sort of a cycle. And so he's always taken aback. At one point, he has this friend that he really trusts, and he runs into this friend. This is later on in the novel, and he runs into this friend, and the friend says, I don't see you in town that much anymore. And so he says, yeah, there's so much going on, and there's a revolutionary or a savior apostle on every corner, and within that apostle there's an exterminate the Jews, someone who's wanting to exterminate the Jews. And so it's just too exhausting, it's too poisonous. And his friend goes, oh yeah, I know what you mean, but there really is a Jewish problem. Yeah, so he was like, what? So he just that sort of thing, like someone he thought he knew comes along and really sort of that sort of slaps him in the face that, yes, reminds him that, yes, things really are the way they are. So just some thoughts about the book. I really tried to read this book. It takes place. It was published in 1934, like I mentioned, so before World War II, so before the actual Jewish Holocaust of World War II, so before that, and so I tried to read this book in that light. Like, I tried to read the book like not knowing how it all happened, not try to read the book without the hindsight that we have today, because, like, for example, among his fellow Jewish students back when he's in university, there's some think that communism is gonna come along and gonna help them, and then some are at least one is Zionist, goes to Zionist meetings, because of course this was before the creation of the nation state of Israel, but like that, what they need to do is they need to go and they need to find a place where they can build their own society and be safe. And so I tried to read the book with this in mind, that, trying to sort of read it like it would have been read in 1934, which is without knowing, what ultimately ended up happening. Of course, it's hard to do that because we do wind up knowing what ended up happening. As far as the real life author goes, the real life author was a fairly well-known Romanian. He did make it through the war, and he ended up being killed I think he got hit by a truck or something crossing the street in like a pedestrian vehicle accident in 1945. So he went through this whole period of the war only to be killed in sort of a senseless act of a senseless accident. So he actually kept a real journal, a real life journal that chronicles this period of time, that is nonfiction, his actual journal that was published. And I think that would be a really fascinating read as well. His brother eventually, had the manuscript, had the journals, and I think eventually immigrated to Israel, and they were published in the 60s, I believe. Yeah, just to me, it was a really interesting read to read this young, because I've wondered how, how Jewish people, experienced that, what their experience was of the 30s. This starts before the 30s, but, that whole period before World War II, and, he obviously the currents were there already. He did have this friend saying, there's a Jewish problem, and I think that Romania has too many Jews, and we need to get rid of some. If it were up to me, I think he says something like, I think I would there needs to be at least several 100,000 less, or a million less, or something. So anyway, very interesting from that standpoint, and just a very sort of, I think, instructive view of identity in the play in a culture like this that has decided that you don't belong to their culture. Which is another point that I want to make before I run out of time, is that he loves the Danube Valley. He's from there, his father's from there, and so he reflects on that a lot. He's a Romanian. He comes from the Danube, and that's something that he says they can't take that away from him no matter what, because that's his connection. He does feel a connection to that. If not to the society and to other people so much. But anyway, very good read. So what I'm currently reading now, before I run out of time, I want to just touch base real briefly on that. I did mention it in my last video, but I am reading Moby Dick as Philosophy by Mark Anderson. This is a work of nonfiction all about Moby Dick and the philosophy in Moby Dick. So far, I'm really kind of just starting out in it, but so far it's been really super interesting. So for... there'll be more coming up when I do the chat, which should be coming up fairly soon. So for April, I am now about halfway through my priority reading list. So for April, I have decided to do several interruption reads. And since I have this one handy in a hardcover, I'm going to talk about this one first. This is the fearless Benjamin Leigh, the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist. This man lived in the 18th century and was a fairly radical abolitionist for the time, and was basically a social outcast for it, I believe. Was not afraid to run counter to the culture around him in order to stick to his moral principles. And so I find people like this very fascinating. So I want to get to this as an interruption. And then I'm going to read... Varina by Charles Frazier. I love Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain, and I read his other book, which I think is called 13 Moons or something like that. I read that years ago. But yeah, Charles Frazier, this is his new book coming out. This is about Varina is the wife of Jefferson Davis. I have the blurb here that I thought I would just read. In his powerful new novel, Charles Frazier returns to the time and place of Cold Mountain, vividly bringing to life the chaos and devastation of Civil War. Sooner or later, history asks, which side were you on? Her marriage prospects limited, teenage Varina Howell agrees to wed the much older widower Jefferson Davis, with whom she expects the secure life of a Mississippi landowner. Davis instead pursues a career in politics and is eventually appointed president of the Confederacy, placing Varina at the white-hot center of one of the darkest moments of American history, culpable regardless of her intentions. The Confederacy failing, her marriage in tatters, and the country divided, Varina and her children escape Richmond and travel south on their own, now fugitives with bounties on their head, an entire nation in pursuit. So that's going to be Varina. It sounds really good. I really, really loved Cold Mountain, so I'm really hoping that it's sort of along those same lines. And then for my next interruption read, Charles Frazier is going to be presenting this book, Varina, at Politics and Prose here, a local bookstore on April 5th, and so I do plan to attend that, so I'm hoping to snag me a signed copy. But then later on April 10th, Circe's coming out by Madeline Miller. I read The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller a couple of years ago. This is historical fiction set in ancient Greece and among the mythology of ancient Greece. So for the blurb for this, in the house of Helios, god of the sun and mightiest of the Titans, a daughter is born. But Circe is a strange child, not powerful like her father, nor viciously alluring like her mother. Turning to the world of mortals for companionship, she discovers that she does possess power, the power of witchcraft, which can transform rivals into monsters and menace the gods themselves. Threatened, Zeus banishes her to a deserted island where she hones her occult craft, tames wild beasts, and crosses paths with many of the most famous figures in all of mythology, including the Minotaur, Daedalus, and his doomed son Icarus, the murderous Medea, and of course, wily Odysseus. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to Circe. So I'm going to be reading Benjamin Leigh, a biography. I'm going to be reading Varina, a historical fiction set in the Civil War, and I'm going to be reading Circe, a historical fiction set in ancient Greece, the mythological world of ancient Greece. So it all should be super good. Not sure which order I'm going to read them in yet, so that'll be a surprise. So stay tuned, and until next time, take care. Bye.